250 miles. That is how far behind enemy lines a small group of British commandos were dropped on the night of the 14th of November, 1941. 250 miles of Italian-controlled Libya. 250 miles of desert, escarpment, torrential rain, enemy patrols, and the near-certain knowledge that if anything went wrong, nobody was coming to get them. They had 3 nights to walk to their target, 3 minutes to do the job, and 1 chance to walk back. The target was the most wanted man in North Africa, the commander of the Africa Corps, the general whose name had become a curse on British lips from Cairo to London, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. They walked into the wrong house. That is not a narrative flourish. That is the hard, documented, appalling truth. After a landing that nearly drowned half the raiding party, after a march across an 1,800-foot escarpment in lightning and freezing rain, after 3 days of cold caves and chattering teeth and morale bleeding out into the mud, 25 men stormed a villa in the Libyan hills at 1 minute to midnight on the 17th of November. The door was kicked down. Grenades were thrown. Submachine guns emptied into rooms. A lieutenant colonel, the youngest in the British Army, took a bullet and died on the front steps of the building he had traveled 2,000 miles to destroy. Rommel was not inside. Rommel had never, in any meaningful sense, been inside. He was in Rome that night, eating dinner with his wife, celebrating his 50th birthday 2 days late. The building the commandos had just stormed was a quartermaster's office, a logistics center, the headquarters of a supply officer called Schleusner, who was, at that precise moment, not even in Libya. He was in a hospital in Athens. And yet the story that unfolds here, the story of 25 men who walked 100 miles through Libyan desert and Libyan rain to kill a man who was never there, is not a story of failure. It is a story of something stranger and older and harder to measure. It is a story of what the British Army demanded of the individual soldier in 1941 and what that soldier was willing to give in return. The raid itself would become one of the most studied commando operations of the Second World War, not because it succeeded, but because of what it revealed about the men who carried it out. To understand how 4 Scottish commandos, a submarine called HMS Torbay, and a rain-soaked villa in a forgotten Libyan hamlet became a defining moment in the birth of modern British Special Forces, you have to go back to the summer of 1940. To an empty parade square in the Scottish border town of Galashiels, where a brand-new commanding officer called Lieutenant Colonel Dick Pedder was staring at 100 volunteers and wondering what on earth he was going to do with them. The commando concept itself was less than a month old. Winston Churchill, reeling from the disaster of Dunkirk and fixated on the idea of striking back at a German-occupied Europe that stretched from Norway to the Pyrenees, had demanded the creation of a new kind of soldier. Troops specially trained, as he wrote in a June 1940 memo, to develop what he called a reign of terror down the enemy coast. 12 commando units were formed within weeks. Volunteers were called for from every regiment of the British Army. Number 11, Commando, raised in Scotland, was one of the first to reach operational strength. Its ranks were drawn almost exclusively from Scottish regiments: the Cameron Highlanders, the Gordon Highlanders, the Royal Scots, the Scots Greys. Men who had grown up on hill farms in Perthshire and tenements in Glasgow and fishing ports in Aberdeenshire. Men who, in the summer of 1940, were asked to do something unprecedented. They were asked to march 90 miles from Galashiels in the Scottish borders to the port of Ayr on the west coast, carrying full kit through the Pentland Hills and over high moorland that ascends several times above 1,000 feet. Those who could not complete the march were returned to their parent units without ceremony. Those who did boarded the Glen Sannox at Fairlie and sailed for the Isle of Arran, a lump of granite and heather in the Firth of Clyde that would become the training ground for the embryonic British Commando Force. Arran was hard. The wind there in winter comes in off the Atlantic without a single landmass to break it. The men billeted in the White House at Lamlash rented from the Duchess of Montrose for the officers, and in hotels and private homes for the rankers, spent months climbing Goatfell in the dark, crossing freezing streams, learning to handle folding canoes known as fullbots, and practicing amphibious landings in the kind of gray, freezing seas that the Royal Navy considered marginal for anything smaller than a destroyer. By the time No. 11 Commando sailed for the Middle East on the 31st of January, 1941, aboard the landing ships HMS Glenurn and HMS Glengyle, the unit had been hammered into something the British Army had never really possessed before. A formation of light infantry raiders who could move further, carry more, and endure longer than any standard battalion. They wore the tam o' shanter and a distinctive black hackle, and they were going to war. The war they found was not the one they expected. After garrison duties in Cyprus, No. 11 Commando was thrown into Operation Exporter, the Allied invasion of Vichy French-held Syria and Lebanon. On the 8th of June 1941, they conducted the first opposed amphibious landing by a complete commando unit in British military history at the mouth of the Litani River. It was a bloodbath. 406 men went ashore. 130 were killed or wounded in 29 hours of fighting against Vichy French troops who should not have been there, with weapons that should have been somewhere else, in a war nobody had asked for. The commanding officer, Colonel Dick Petter, was killed in action, along with Captain Robin Farmelow and Lieutenant Alistair Coode. Nearly every officer in Y Party was dead, wounded, or captured. Command passed to a 24-year-old captain named Geoffrey Keyes. Keyes was not an ordinary officer. His father, Admiral of the Fleet Sir Roger Keyes, was a British naval legend. A hero of the Zeebrugge raid in 1918, a veteran of Gallipoli, and by 1940, the first director of combined operations under Winston Churchill. Geoffrey was his eldest son. Educated at Eton and Sandhurst, commissioned into the Royal Scots Greys, he had seen action at Narvik in the Norwegian campaign and transferred to commandos at the earliest opportunity. At Litani, he led his troop with a calm ferocity that earned him the Military Cross. When he inherited command of No. 11 Commando in the smoking ruins of the Litani battlefield, he was the youngest acting lieutenant colonel in the British Army. He was also, by late 1941, a man running out of time. Lay Force, the umbrella formation that contained No. 11 Commando, was being dismantled. Men were being returned to parent regiments. Some were being folded into a new experimental unit called L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade, under a quiet, tall Scots Guards lieutenant named David Stirling. Others were going to the Long Range Desert Group, or the Special Boat Section. Keyes, determined to save his unit, persuaded his father in London to intervene. He was allowed to retain 110 volunteers while he looked for a mission that would justify their continued existence. In September, the mission found him. An officer Keyes had known in the Royal Scots Greys, now serving with the Special Operations Executive, told him that Rommel had been seen at a headquarters in a place called Beta Litoria, a village on the escarpment of the Jebel al-Akhtar, the Green Mountain, 18 miles inland from the Libyan coast. 250 miles behind the German and Italian front line. Intelligence agents among the local Senussi Arabs had reported Rommel's staff car coming and going from a large building the Italians called the Prefettura. The Desert Fox, the man who had humiliated the British Army across 500 miles of Libyan desert in the spring of 1941, the man Churchill himself had called a great general, was sleeping, as far as British intelligence was concerned, in a villa on the Cyrenaican coast. Keyes took the plan to General Sir Alan Cunningham, commander of the Commonwealth Western Desert Forces. The timing was right. General Sir Claude Auchinleck was preparing a massive offensive, codenamed Operation Crusader, to begin on the 18th of November. Its objectives were to lift the siege of Tobruk and clear the Axis forces from Libya. Churchill, always hungry for the spectacular, envisioned Crusader as a victory to rank with Blenheim and Waterloo. What better way to begin it, Keyes argued, than by decapitating the German command structure in North Africa? Kill Rommel on the eve of Crusader, and the Africa Corps would be leaderless at the precise moment the Eighth Army struck. Cunningham was persuaded. Operation Flipper was approved. The groundwork had already been laid by a man whose name deserves to be spoken alongside any SAS legend of the Second World War. Captain John Edward Haselden, known to his friends as Jock. A British-born Egyptian cotton merchant who spoke perfect Arabic and fluent Italian, who had served in the Libyan Arab Force, and who had been walking in and out of Italian-occupied Libya disguised as a Senussi tribesman for most of 1941. On the 10th of October, Haselden had been landed from HMS Torbay on a beach near Hama on the Cyrenaican coast, accompanied only by an Arab from the Libyan Arab Force. Bearded, weather-beaten, carrying a shepherd's staff, wearing tattered robes, he had walked alone through the Jebel al-Akhdar for nearly 2 weeks. He had, according to some accounts, watched Rommel himself stride out of the prefettura at Beta Litoria and drive away in a command car. He had been extracted by the long-range desert group on the 27th of October and brought back to Cairo with the intelligence that would seal the plan. What Haselden could not know, what no one on the British side knew, was that the car and the uniforms he had watched were not Rommel's at all. They belonged to the chief quartermaster of Panzergruppe Afrika, General Schleusner, who happened to be of similar build and wore similar field gray. Rommel had used the building briefly in September, but he had already moved his operational headquarters closer to Tobruk by the time Haselden laid eyes on the prefettura. The Desert Fox, who considered it a matter of principle to be near the front line with his troops, reportedly later expressed astonishment that the British had ever imagined his headquarters would be 250 miles behind his own lines. But on the evening of the 10th of November 1941, none of this was known. What was known in the submarine pens at Alexandria was that 2 T-class submarines of the Royal Navy were preparing to take on an unusual cargo. HMS Torbay, commanded by the already decorated Lieutenant Commander Anthony Mears, and HMS Talisman, under Lieutenant Commander Michael Wilmot, would each carry roughly half of the commando raiding force, 6 officers and 53 other ranks. 550 tons of Royal Navy steel, carrying 59 commandos, their weapons, their explosives, 2 full-bots for the beach landing party, and 14 rubber dinghies for transporting men ashore. Keyes traveled aboard Torbay with Captain Robin Campbell, a fluent German speaker, Lieutenant Roy Cook, and 25 men, plus 2 Senussi Arab guides and a Palestinian corporal named Avishalom Drori to act as interpreter. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Laycock, the commander of Middle East Commando Operations and a man so consistently lucky in battle that his nickname was Lucky Laycock, traveled aboard Talisman as the overall supervisor of the raid. He had reservations about the operation, according to every account, and he expressed them to Keyes more than once. The odds, he believed, were against anyone returning. But Keyes, whose determination to prove himself worthy of his father's name bordered on the monomaniacal, had pushed the plan through. Laycock would accompany the raid as an observer and coordinator. He would not lead the assault. 2 days out of Alexandria, in the close air of the submarine's mess deck, Keyes told his men what they were actually going to do. Up until that point, the mission had been described only as a raid on an enemy headquarters. Now, by the yellow light of the electric bulbs, Keyes revealed the truth. They were going after Rommel. If he comes quietly, Keyes is recorded as saying, "We will bring him along." The understatement was almost theatrical. The men, by most accounts, received the news in stunned silence. They were being asked to kidnap the most famous German general of the war from his bedroom, or failing that, to shoot him. On the 13th of November, Torbay and Talisman arrived off the Cyrenaican coast, 20 miles west of Apollonia. The weather was already going bad. A gale was building out of the Mediterranean, the sea was running high, and a light rain was falling. Ashore, Hazelden, dropped by parachute a few days earlier, signaled from a small cove with an Aldous lamp. The submarines flashed back the recognition signal, and the disaster began. The commandos had trained for submarine-to-shore landings in the calm, clear waters off Alexandria. Nothing had prepared them for what they faced at Kashm al-Kalb, the cove that Arab tribesmen called the Dog's Nose. The rubber dinghies passed up through the forward hatch and inflated on the pitching deck were swept overboard by waves. Men slipped off the slippery steel hull and had to be hauled back aboard. Keyes's landing took 7 hours instead of the planned 90 minutes. By dawn on the 14th, he and 28 men were ashore, wet, frozen, and shivering. Talisman's landing was worse. When she maneuvered to put Laycock's men over the side, she grounded on a submerged reef. The jolt swept 7 of her landing boats, with 11 men aboard, clean off the deck into a running sea. Some were never seen again. Of Laycock's half of the raiding force, only Laycock himself and 7 men reached the beach. The rest were stranded on Talisman, which withdrew to deep water to avoid being stranded at daybreak. The dawn of the 15th of November found 36 commandos, instead of 59, huddling in a rocky cove a dozen miles from Beta Littoria, trying to dry their clothes and clean their weapons in the weak Libyan sun. The 2 Senussi guides had drowned during the landing. Critical equipment, including some of the explosives earmarked for sabotage targets, had been lost overboard. The plan, which had called for 4 separate attacks on 4 separate objectives, had to be cut down to 3. Laycock, assessing the damage, gave new orders. Keyes, with 17 men, would take the central target, the Africa Corps' headquarters at Beta Littoria, himself. Lieutenant Roy Cook, with 6 men, would head further east to cut communications near Cyrene. Hazelden, with his small Arab team, would sabotage the telegraph line on the El Fidia-Slanta road. The attack on Rommel's villa, a mile from the Prefettura, was dropped entirely. There were not enough men left to carry it out. Laycock himself, with 3 men, would remain at the landing beach to secure the rendezvous for the extraction. They set off at nightfall on the 15th, accompanied for the first stage by an Arab guide borrowed from Hazelden. The rain had now turned to a storm. The commandos climbed the first terrace of the escarpment, about 800 meters inland, in conditions that were turning biblical. By 9 o'clock in the evening, they had reached the top of the first ridge. At midnight, the Arab guide looked at the rain, looked at the lightning walking across the Jebel al-Akhdar, and refused to go any further. He turned around and vanished into the dark. From that moment, Keyes navigated by map and compass alone. The star sighting that would have allowed cross-checking of his position was impossible under the heavy cloud. The rain was coming down in torrents. The goat tracks through the hills had turned to liquid mud. Thunder rolled through the Cyrenaican hills, and lightning, according to survivor accounts, lit up the landscape in a continuous white flicker. The men climbed an 1,800-foot escarpment in pitch darkness, leaning forward into the wind, sliding back half a step for every step forward. Keyes at the front, checking his compass bearing against a soaked map, setting the pace his men could not quite match, driving them on by what the Victoria Cross citation would later call his stolid determination and powers of leadership. By dawn on the 16th, they had reached a small cave about 5 miles from Beta Littoria. They spent the day inside it, shivering in their wet clothes, unable to light a fire for fear of smoke. They ate cold rations. Some of them slept. Most of them could not. During that day, Keyes did something that reveals a great deal about both his courage and his desperation. He left the cave and walked forward, alone, to observe the target in daylight. The rain drove him back before he could complete the reconnaissance. He sent out an Arab boy, borrowed from a local shepherd who had stumbled on the cave, with instructions to walk past the Prefettura and report what he saw. The boy returned with enough information for Keyes to sketch a rough map of the building's layout, the relationship between the Prefettura and the villa half a mile away, the vehicle park, and the guard positions. At nightfall on the 17th of November, the detachment moved out for the final approach. The storm was now severe. Thunder, lightning, rain so heavy that the men's bomb fuses, carefully sealed in waxed paper, were soaked through. By 10 o'clock at night, in flashes of lightning, they could see an Arab village ahead, and beyond it, the outline of a large building. Beta Littoria. At 3 minutes to midnight, Keyes moved forward with the assault party. He had split his 17 men into groups. Most were positioned to cover the approaches to the building, block the guardhouse, and prevent reinforcement from adjacent buildings. For the actual entry into the prefettura, he had 3 men, himself, Captain Robin Campbell, the German-speaking second in command, and Sergeant Jack Terry, a 19-year-old butcher's son from Nottingham who was acting as Keyes's close bodyguard. 3 men. To kill or capture the commander of the Africa Corps. They crawled forward past the outer sentries, under a barbed wire fence, and up to the front door of the building. Keyes had hoped to find a window or back entrance unlocked, but every opening was either shuttered or barred. He made the decision that would lead directly to his death. He would use Campbell's German to bluff their way in through the front door. Campbell pounded on the door and shouted in German that he needed to enter. A German sergeant opened the door. For a moment, there was a scuffle. Keyes and Terry grabbed the man, trying to overpower him silently. He was too strong, too awake, and too alarmed. Campbell shot him with his revolver. The sound of the shot, muffled by the storm outside, but not muffled enough, rang through the prefettura like a fire alarm. In an instant, every man in the building was awake and reaching for a weapon. What followed lasted perhaps 90 seconds. Terry was posted at the foot of the stairs with a Thompson submachine gun, with orders to fire a burst at anyone who tried to come down. He did. The fire kept the upper floor pinned. Keyes and Campbell moved through the ground floor. The first room, its light still on in the passage, but extinguished inside by its German occupants, Keyes sprayed with his Colt pistol. Campbell threw a grenade in behind him. The explosion shook the building. Keyes turned to the second ground floor room. He flung open the door. He was hit almost instantly by a single pistol shot from inside, through the chest, just above the heart. He fell back into the corridor. Campbell and Terry dragged him outside, into the rain. He died on the steps of the building within a few minutes, aged 24. The accounts of what happened next vary. The official version, contained in the Victoria Cross citation written by Laycock, who was not present, describes a heroic withdrawal under fire. Other accounts, based on witness statements and a German post-mortem examination of Keyes conducted 6 months later, have led some historians, including the former SAS officer and author Michael Asher, to conclude that Keyes may have been accidentally shot by one of his own men rather than by the Germans. Only 1 round was definitively fired by the German occupants during the raid. It is possible that Campbell, firing at a silhouette in the passage, struck Keyes in the chaos. What is certain is that Campbell himself was then shot in the leg moments later, also by one of his own commandos, who had been ordered to shoot on sight. The wound would eventually cost him his leg in a German prisoner of war hospital. Campbell, unable to walk, told Sergeant Terry to take command, gather the men, and get them out. They set fire to a fuel dump on their way out. They killed 4 Germans in total during the raid, by most accounts. They also wrecked a generator and what equipment they could reach. Then Terry, the 19-year-old sergeant, led 17 men back out into the storm. He brought them down the escarpment the same way they had come up, in the rain, in the lightning, without their commander. They reached the beach at the Dog's Nose on the 19th of November, where Laycock and his 3 men were waiting. Cook's detachment, the one sent to Syren, did not come back. They had been ambushed by a platoon of Italian Carabinieri paratroopers near the village of Mansoura. After a running fight and a siege in a cave, they had surrendered. All 6 would spend the rest of the war in captivity. At the landing beach, the situation was deteriorating fast. The weather refused to improve enough for the submarines to send dinghies ashore. HMS Torbay signaled that the swell was too heavy and dropped food on a drifting raft that the wind eventually pushed to the beach. For 3 more days, the commandos huddled in the rocks, eating the cold rations, drying their weapons, waiting. On the afternoon of the 21st of November, Italian and German search parties appeared in the hills. The commandos were spotted. A firefight broke out. Running low on ammunition, aware that the reinforcements closing in on them would overwhelm any defense, Laycock gave a final order. Scatter, every man for himself. Make for British lines. British lines were, at that moment, moving fast. Operation Crusader had begun on the 18th of November, the day after Keyes died. The Eighth Army was driving west through Cyrenaica, but between the commandos at the Dog's Nose and the advancing British armor lay 250 miles of enemy territory, mountain ridges, salt marshes, Bedouin camps both friendly and hostile, and constant Axis patrols. Most of them did not make it. 28 commandos were captured in the days and weeks that followed, including Captain Campbell, who was picked up near the villa with his shattered leg. 2 were killed. 1 man, Lance Corporal P. Barrand, had drowned during the original landing. Only 3 from the entire raiding force reached British lines alive. Colonel Laycock himself. Sergeant Jack Terry, the teenage sergeant who had held the stairs of the Prefettura with a Thompson gun. And Bombardier John Brittlebank of the Special Boat Section, who had guided the dinghies ashore and who, after the scattering, walked alone through the Jebel al-Akhdar for 40 days, living on what he could find, before finally crossing into British territory near Syren. Laycock and Terry traveled together, 37 days in the desert, in winter, with no supplies beyond what they could carry, steal, or beg from sympathetic Senussi tribesmen who hid them at real risk to their own lives. They walked through a landscape crawling with Italian and German patrols, sleeping in caves, crossing wadis flooded by the November rains, subsisting on dates, goat, and occasionally a hare caught in a wire snare. They arrived at 8th Army Headquarters on Christmas Day, 1941, at 9:20 in the evening. A message was dispatched to the Minister of State for the Middle East, Oliver Littleton, announcing that Laycock had arrived in time for his Christmas dinner. Littleton famously signaled back asking why Laycock was 1 hour 20 minutes late. The raid, by any conventional measure, had been a catastrophe. The intelligence on which it was based was wrong. The target was not in the building. He was not in Libya. He was not even in the theater. A German post-war analysis conducted in May 1942 concluded that Rommel had used the Prefettura at Beta Littoria on perhaps 2 occasions, briefly, and had never spent the night there. When the news of the raid reached him at his forward headquarters near Tobruk, where he had returned from Italy on the 18th of November, he was said by his staff to be genuinely indignant at the premise. How, he reportedly asked, could the British have imagined his operational headquarters would be 250 miles behind his own front line? And yet. Rommel's reaction to the raid itself, once the indignation had passed, was not what anyone expected. He ordered that Keyes and the 4 German dead, including an officer named Colonel Jaeger, be buried together with full military honors in the local Catholic cemetery. He sent his personal chaplain, the priest Rudolf Dahler, on a 36-hour drive through rain-soaked wadis and flooded roads to conduct the funeral. The chaplain arrived 10 minutes before the service began. He preached a sermon calling for peace and understanding between nations. He consecrated 5 graves. Rommel ordered photographs taken of Keyes's grave and arranged for them to be sent to the boy's parents in England, a gesture of old-world chivalry that would enter Rommel's own legend. He ordered that the captured British commandos, who were not in uniform and whose status as legal combatants was, under the letter of the Geneva Conventions, extremely questionable, be treated as prisoners of war. It was, in his own words, a brilliant operation carried out with great audacity. The British response back in Cairo and London was more complicated. The raid had failed. 250 miles of nothing. A lieutenant colonel dead. 28 men in German and Italian prison camps. An entire commando unit, number 11, formally disbanded in the weeks that followed, Its survivors scattered to the Long-Range Desert Group, the Special Boat Section, and the growing Special Air Service under David Stirling. Churchill, consoling Admiral Sir Roger Keyes on the loss of his son, said a line that has passed into British military folklore. "I would far rather," the Prime Minister said, "have Geoffrey alive than Rommel dead." On the 19th of June, 1942, the London Gazette announced the posthumous award of the Victoria Cross to Lieutenant Colonel Geoffrey Charles Tasker Keyes. The citation, written by Laycock, described an attack against overwhelming odds, leadership of the highest order, and supreme self-sacrifice. Modern historians have pointed out that almost none of the specific claims in the citation are verifiable from independent witness accounts. What is beyond question, the detail that no revisionist analysis has ever undone, is that Keyes walked. He walked 100 miles from the beach through storm and mountain to a building he had never seen, commanding men whose language was not always his own, with intelligence he could not have known was wrong, to kill a man he would never have recognized if he had met him. And when the door opened and the sentry could not be taken silently, he was the first through. He took the bullet that was meant for the idea of Rommel, the idea that the British Army, in the dark winter of 1941, could still strike anywhere, that no German, however famous, was safe in his own headquarters, that there were men in the Commonwealth who would walk 100 miles through a Libyan thunderstorm to put a gun to his head. The wider legacy of Operation Flipper outlived Geoffrey Keyes by decades. The lessons were unsparing. Intelligence had been wrong, weather planning had been inadequate, extraction had been improvised. The very concept of sending a light commando force 250 miles behind lines to conduct a precision decapitation strike in an era without helicopters or satellite weather forecasting was a level of operational ambition that even the SAS of later decades would approach with more caution. The combined operations staff in Whitehall critiqued the mission ruthlessly. The commando formations that came afterwards, the ones that raided Saint-Nazaire and Bruneval, the ones that went ashore on D-Day, the Special Boat Squadron, and the Special Air Service Regiment that would fight from Sicily to the Rhine, all inherited lessons paid for in Libyan rain in November 1941. Sergeant Jack Terry lived. He was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for his actions at Beta Littoria, a decoration sometimes described as the enlisted man's Victoria Cross. He served for the rest of the war and lived into the 1990s. Bombardier John Brittlebank, who walked 40 days alone through the desert, was also awarded the DCM. Captain Robin Campbell, who lost his leg in a German hospital, survived the war as a prisoner and lived to write his own account of the raid in 1943. Jock Hazelden, the Libyan Arab Force officer whose reconnaissance had started it all, was killed in action less than a year later in September 1942 during the disastrous raid on Tobruk. He is commemorated on the Alamein Memorial. Robert Laycock, the lucky one, rose to the rank of Major General and eventually succeeded Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten as the second Director of Combined Operations. The Prefettura at Beta Littoria still stands. The village is now called Al-Baida. The road that led from the Dog's Nose Cove up to the escarpment that Keyes climbed in the thunderstorm is still walkable, if anyone chooses to walk it. And somewhere in the soil of what used to be the local Catholic cemetery before Keyes was reinterred in the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery at Benghazi, there was for a short time a row of 5 graves, British and German, with a chaplain's consecration spoken over them by a priest who had driven 36 hours through rain to arrive 10 minutes before the service began. The raid was a failure. The men were not. That is the distinction that the professional armies of the world have been chewing over ever since. An operation can fail entirely. The premise can be wrong. The intelligence can be wrong. The weather can turn catastrophic. The primary target can be hundreds of miles away eating dinner with his wife. And still, somehow, the measure of what was done that night in the Libyan hills cannot be reduced to a simple column of successes and failures. 25 men, under a 24-year-old colonel, walked 100 miles through storm and darkness to the wrong house. They kicked the door down anyway. They fought their way in anyway. They died on the front steps anyway. And the man they had come to kill, hundreds of miles away, when he heard the story, ordered that they be buried with honor. Because he recognized, as professional soldiers always do, the thing that his enemy had brought with them into the rain at Beta Litoria, not the intelligence. That had been wrong. Not the equipment. That had failed. Not the plan. That had collapsed the moment the storm broke on the 14th of November. The men had not failed. The men had walked 100 miles through a Libyan thunderstorm, carrying bombs in their pockets and a country's hope on their backs. And they had gone through the door. Wrong house, right men.